Hey everybody, Nick here, and this morning I got a review for you of this ridiculous big guy, and that's the Spyderco K2. As you can see here, this is a knife designed by Farid, who's a very interesting knife designer. And before we go too much further, though, I want to make a quick note. This K2 looks different than many others. The original K2 has a little bit more of an upswept tip than this guy does. A little bit almost a Persian design. I'm not a huge fan of upswept tips, and so I knew that in order to love this knife, I would need to do a little modification. So I used a grinding wheel, and I knocked it down into something that looks a little bit more Gale Bradley-ish. So, although everything I'm going to say is going to be true about the actual knife itself, this one particularly is maybe more of a K1.8, 1.7. Knocked a little length off and certainly removed some of the trailing tip. So, let's just be completely straightforward about that. The grind is a little different here. Let's do some quick size comparison, because this knife, well, the size on this knife is very interesting. We'll start off with the Ontario Rat number 2. The K2 is slightly larger. The Ontario Rat number 1, the K2 is still slightly larger. The ZT452CF, the K2 is larger than that, 100%. Let's see here, some knives more in the size class. This is a Victorinox Classic. As you can see here, the K2 is a little bit bigger than this guy. The Spyderco Rhodey, which is almost as big as the K2, but not quite. And, of course, your Spyderco Delica, and just because they're a good comparison together, the Spyderco Sleesh Bowie here. The K2 is freaking huge, yeah, I believe is the technical term. So anyways, now that we've talked about the size, let's go ahead and jump into the good, the great, the bad, and the ugly of this particular ridiculously large knife. So on the good side, this knife is simply constructed, and I always appreciate that. Practically speaking, the elements of this guy are a blade, a pair of phosphor bronze washers in there, and then 2 screws, this guy in the back and this guy in the front. There's also a lanyard tube here, but it doesn't play a huge role. So there's not really all that much going on here, which is nice in many ways. Also, the screws here are identical, which is not something that's super common, but I think it works out nicely here. And so in terms of simplicity of build, this guy doesn't get much better than this. The stonewash is really nice on the scales here, and I'll try and show it off a little bit, but it's a little bit more, I don't know, figured than a lot of the Spyderco stonewashes. It doesn't have the same mirrored effect as the Sleesh Bowie, but it's got a nice texture to it. I got no objections to it whatsoever. Kind of an acid wash maybe on the titanium. Either way, I like it. Speaking of other little details here, you can see that the spine has been rounded in this little area alone. Out of the box, you get this rounding to it, and that's kind of neat. And it's a nice little area for your thumb to rest. If your thumb was resting on a flat surface like this guy, it'd be a little bit harder to go for ergonomically, but, you know, this is decent enough, so I like that. Speaking of things that are rounded interestingly, take a look at this back spacer. This back spacer looks like a squished ball bearing or something like that. I like it. I don't know why it exists in that form, but by God it does, and I appreciate it. It's a nice little interesting touch here. And it's yet another sign that Spyderco is doing something a little bit weird here, although, did you really need another sign? Anyways, moving along. The lockpaw cutout is interesting because, unlike any other Spyderco I'm aware of, it's using this back and forth sort of jigged pattern. That's maybe not the term I want, but nonetheless. Which is actually, I'm told, a little bit, that's kind of a signature for Farid Mare. So that's kind of nice. And also, note that there is a lockbar stabilizer. That's what this little hole is for here. And if we shine a little light in there, we can see the stabilizer itself. And normally I say something along the lines of, well, it's got a lockbar stabilizer, and although that's not completely necessary, it's nice to have. On a blade this big, with a lockbar this long, and scales this thin, I feel like it is actually completely necessary, because you get a lot of leverage on this stabilizer, and I can very easily see, without that being there, being able to push the stabilizer way past where you want to go, and spring the lock. So that's an important point here, more so than, frankly, any other knife I've handled. I appreciate that they went there. Nice. what is done here is done pretty well. I'll say that. It's a Taichung Spyderco. It's made in Taiwan, and that tends to give good quality, and that's here there as well. All the milling is well done, and honestly, the fit and finish is, by and large, pretty damn good. There's no real objection there. Speaking of which, the action on this guy is very, very smooth. I haven't even, obviously, I haven't carried this guy super much, but even as it is, it's very, very smooth. I'm very happy with the action on this knife, and that's a credit to the Taichung factory. They really do a great job with it. Then finally, the blade on this guy is really good for slicing. The reason I say that is because the blade itself is not all that thick. Let's see here. What's a good comparison? It's actually about the same width as your ZT452CF. A good bit wider than the Delica, though. The thing is, though, you've got a whole lot of blade distance to travel while you're slicing, and so as you slice into something, it's only being wedged apart slowly. And at the very edge here, it's pretty thin. And so that makes this knife kind of a slicing monster in a lot of ways. And CPM 10V, which is the steel here, is unusual, but it's got very, very high wear resistance, and it's pretty much good to go. So this knife could have a very, very happy life as sort of a portable kitchen knife, or a portable camp knife, or something like that. Because when it's folded up, it's just any other object, but when you pop it open, you have a reasonably big sort of kitchen knife affair. So I really do like that. This is a great blade for slicing, and I think that's really where this blade is perhaps at its most comfortable. So that's your good. You've got a nice simple construction, a nice stonewash, the rounded spine, the rounded back spacer, and a couple of other nice details make this nicely done. What's done here is done well by the Taichung factory. The action on it is actually pretty smooth, and it's a great blade for slicing overall. Let's go ahead and talk about the grate. Honestly, the great thing about this knife is that it is absolutely huge and ridiculous. I mean, the K2 is defined in many ways by its size, and especially with that factory upswept, you take this out of your pocket and you look a little crazy, and that's pretty excellent, honestly. It's a pocket sword. You own this knife, I think, in many ways more for effect than anything. Because I mean, holy crap, you take this out of your pocket and you make it a little bit of a statement. And I think that's really what the K2 is best at, is being a little huge, a little crazy, a little ridiculous, and also slicing very effectively. So I think that's the great. What sets this knife apart more than anything else is just how huge and crazy it really is. And I respect that. It's really single-minded in its pursuit of that. So there you go. That's your good. That's your great. Let's talk about the bad. On the bad side, this knife is absolutely huge and ridiculous. It is probably against every law that your city and or state has. You know, it's a knife that you take out of your pocket at a Starbucks and the people immediately evacuate. It's, you know, it's a little crazy. And so if you're carrying something like the K2, I might recommend that you accompany it with something a little bit more subtle for situations where the people around you might be terrified by you taking out something quite so crazy. And so that can be bad for a lot of people. This is not a knife that you want to underestimate the size of. I took it out of the box knowing full well I was buying big, crazy, and ridiculous, and still said, holy crap, this is huge. And the fiancé just started laughing. So, you know, you got to keep that in mind. That can be bad for a lot of people in a lot of situations. Next thing that is really a matter of taste as well is the upswept tip. I really don't love the upswept tip that this guy came from the factory with. It makes the knife feel a little bit more raggro, and given it's definitely a part of the design, and in some ways people are going to think I neutered it by doing this, but for me, I don't love those because it makes it, it's easy to get that kind of thing caught on whatever you've been slicing through. To grab that tip up again. Honestly, it brings the tip of the knife a little bit close to the edge of the scales here, which is not something I'm super in love with. You can see that even with a little bit removed, it's right up towards that edge. So, I don't know. Not a big fan of the upswept tip, but that's personal. There are going to be people out there who are going, oh my God, Nick, that upswept tip, how could you remove that? So whatever. More well, not realistic, but more objective, if you will. I'm not a big fan of the lack of sharpening choil on this guy. This knife is very wear resistant, so it shouldn't come up for a while. But I really do wish that they'd thrown a little choil onto this. I think it would have made it a little bit better. So be it, though. The lockup on this guy is 90% or so. It is very, very securely locked up. There's nothing that's going to change this, but I worry that you're going to be hitting the side of the lock bar before too long here. And especially given that it's using just titanium on steel, I don't know. That makes me ask a couple of little questions. It's not a bad thing in the grand scheme of life. Am I really freaking out about that lockup? No, not necessarily. But it is a little disconcerting to get a knife out the box and have a 90% lockup. Whatever. Not a big deal. And then finally, the retail price on this guy is a little crazy. You're looking at $230 is the price most people are selling it at. Although I got this guy at $150 brand new from the Knife Center. They've been selling them at that price for whatever reason. So, at $150, I think this is very plausible. At $230, I just don't know. That you gotta really love the design. So, anyways, that's your bad. It is absolutely huge and ridiculous, and it's just gonna scare the crap out of people if you take it out your pocket. Not a big fan of the upswept tip in the original unmodified version. The lack of sharpening choil makes me sad. The 90% lockup is a little unusual and not something I'm in love with. And finally, the retail price is a little on the crazy side. So, let's talk about the ugly. So on the ugly side, a couple of things. First off, this knife did have some pretty severe lock stick out of the box. I've been able to resolve it pretty effectively by using a little bit of a permanent marker, just a little Sharpie. And what you do is you draw a little bit on the blade tang where it contacts, and then you draw a little bit on the lock face surface over here. And that pretty much provides a medium for the lock stick to go away. Is it the smoothest opening knife I've ever owned? No, by no means. And it'll probably get better with age anyways. But the lock stick is definitely an issue here, and I can definitely sympathize with the people who complain about that. Next issue is that this is right side tip down carry only. So this can only carry one way in your pocket, like this. And unfortunately, I can almost get tip down carry for this blade being as big and heavy and pointy as it is. With that original trailing point, if this blade comes even a little bit out, you're in for some serious laceration. So I can see it almost here. But the thing is, that's exacerbated by the fact that you've got some sharp corners on this knife. So if you've got this hanging in your pocket like this, every time you reach your hand into your pocket, you're going to be hitting this surface here. And I've already sanded and rounded this down a little bit. This was very sharp, and this isn't so pleasant either. And so this tip-up carry leaves both of these things to attack whatever's left in your pocket. That's just not great. And you've got some other sharpened corners on this guy, too. The lock bar cutout here has some edges that really need to be milled down a little bit, or sanded down a bit. And then also this right here, where the lock bar kind of closes in, I'd love to see a little bit more sanding on this guy. If I was going to keep this in the long term, I would 100% bust out the Dremel and do a little bit more love there. But, I don't know. So that is something to keep in mind. Those sharpened corners can be a big problem. Then finally, those sharpened corners contribute, along with the fact that this is a very thin and very long knife. I mean, in terms of thickness, this knife is actually a little thinner than the Spyderco Delica overall. But it's also very huge in the hand. And so this gives a knife and there's no rounding whatsoever to these scales. So it's long, flat, and thin. And that means that the ergonomics on this knife are just not very good. They're not terrible. It definitely works, and I could gut with this for a longer period of time. But compared to most other Spydercos, the ergos here are just not great. And the clip particularly is a very big hot spot. I very much wish that they'd given me a tip-up carry position, because that would go much better with the hand. Now, I also have small hands, though, so it could be that with a larger hand, this is going to fit wonderfully. But at least for me, the ergonomics here are not great, and there are a lot of hot spots off of these little sharpened areas and whatnot. So, I don't know. That's your ugly. There is some lock stick. It's right side tipped down only. There were a bunch of little sharpened corners all over the place, and the ergonomics, as a result, are just not very good. Let's give a final verdict here. The K2, at some level, is a great illustration of the idea that the bigger a knife is, the less you can afford to finish it as a manufacturer, the less ambitious you can really be. It's not so much that there were corners cut here, although I would argue that the clip up, tip down only is a corner that was cut here. But it's things that they didn't choose to go on to do. The scales here are flat, unlike on your Sleesh Bowie where they're rounded off. I know that's difficult and expensive, but it would have really turned this into a much better knife, I think, ergonomically speaking. There's no real rounding of any of these corners. They didn't do any of the post-processing steps that would kind of melt these down a little bit and make them a little bit nicer in the handle. They didn't do any kind of edging. I feel like this kind of a thing, where you get a bevel along the edge of the flat slab side, would have made this knife a lot nicer in the hand. It's a Graham Razel, by the way, and they didn't do that here. And so there were a bunch of little things that they could have done, and even the blade finish is, compared to the Sleesh Bowie, a lot less interesting. This guy has more of a mirrored finish. This guy is just a flat-out machine finished. So I feel like, in many ways, the retail price on this guy reflects largely the fact that you've got big chunks of expensive materials, and they did their best with it. They still got some good details, the ribbing here, the rounded back spacer, but this knife would have been perhaps even more compelling done as a higher-end knife than it already is. And actually, I'm going to do a video that just compares and contrasts the Sleesh Bowie and the K2 a little bit more explicitly, because there is a lot of comparison there. They came out about the same time, the pivot screws the same, etc. So keep an eye out for that. But in terms of the K2 itself, honestly, this is a really odd knife. If you haven't figured it out that far, if you haven't figured that out this far, then you got yourself a problem. But anyways, it's absolutely huge, and it's absolutely ridiculous, but it's also really nicely put together, using good materials. And it's a very specialized knife. It's a crazy big slicer. I can see this guy being an effective kind of camp kitchen knife, or just a kitchen knife that if you fold and, carry it around, why not? I don't know. I don't quite know who this is specialized for, but it's special indeed. And honestly, it's not so stellar in the hand, which makes it a little bit more limited in terms of its audience. It's just crying out for further customization, for custom scales. I've seen some great scale regrinds that round them off a little bit that I bet would be really compelling on this guy. So, at the end of the day, do I recommend this knife? Not really. You've got to really know that this is the knife for you. If somebody wants this, if you're looking at this and saying, oh God, I want a K2, Nick, should I buy a K2? Then buy the K2. Especially if you can do that $150 price, if that's still going on, you're going to be fine. But it's not a knife that I can just widely say, yeah, everybody go out and get a K2, because it's absolutely absurd. And if you're an absurd person, like some of us are, then you might like this, but maybe it's not your flavor of absurd. So, at least now you know what you're getting into with the Spyderco K2, and if you need something big and ridiculous in your life, well, by God, give it a shot. Hope this has been interesting to you, that you have yourself an absolutely ridiculous and excellent rest of your day. Bye now.